In less than 3 minutes, the air shifted. Dershowitz, known for rapid-fire rebuttals and academic bravado, was cut down, not by shouting or scandal, but by a calm, surgical question that stopped him cold. No stammering defense, no clever retort. Just stunned silence from a man who had never lacked for words. The moment left viewers numb, the studio breathless, and the control room whispering, "Don't cut away. We're witnessing history." How did a second-term congresswoman dismantle one of the most feared legal minds in America, live with cameras rolling? What was the one question that shattered decades of televised confidence? You're about to find, and trust me, you'll want to watch until the end. This isn't just a debate, it's a masterclass in accountability. If you believe truth matters more than titles, hit like, subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell. Let's dive in. The CNN studio was clinical, almost sterile in its perfection. Walls lined with smooth glass, lights engineered to eliminate every shadow, and a silence that buzzed with unspoken expectations. It wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like one. At the center of the set, under surgical lighting and behind gleaming cameras, sat a sleek debate table. 2 chairs faced each other like dueling witness stands. One was already occupied by a man who didn't just appear comfortable. He looked like he owned the room. Professor Alan Dershowitz, now in his 80s, carried 5 decades of legal stardom into that chair like a crown. He had defended presidents, billionaires, and men whose names had ignited protests. His confidence wasn't exaggerated. It was earned, televised, and immortalized in best-selling books and courtroom drama. Every crease in his suit whispered authority. Every glance across the studio was a quiet reminder, I've out-talked sharper minds than you in 10 different eras. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat with stillness that came not from nerves, but from calculation. She was younger, sharper in her silence, and had no desire to impress the cameras. Her reputation wasn't built on cable news segments or Ivy League seminars. It was forged in courtrooms filled with grief-stricken families and systemic injustice. As a civil rights attorney, she had challenged the kinds of laws that Dershowitz had once helped interpret from the safety of an academic podium. Dressed in a clean-cut navy suit with only a small congressional pin for flair, she didn't project power. She embodied responsibility. The contrast between the two couldn't have been sharper. One arrived with a long shadow of accolades and controversies. The other with a folder of facts and a practiced ability to wait for her moment. The debate topic was executive privilege, but to the millions watching, that legal term meant little at first. What they understood was simpler: power, accountability, and truth. The question on the table, whether a former president could still claim executive privilege to avoid scrutiny, was a legal minefield. It was the kind of discussion where Dershowitz had historically thrived, weaving centuries of precedent into persuasive, bulletproof arguments. As Anderson Cooper introduced the topic, the studio's temperature seemed to drop. Everyone, from the control room to the makeup artist off stage, sensed this wouldn't be a routine debate. Dershowitz leaned in first. His voice was steady, familiar to any viewer who'd watched legal coverage over the years. He invoked the Founding Fathers, separation of powers, and the need for presidents to have confidential advice. He referenced rulings from 1974, 1982, 2004, all delivered in the same cadence that had once swayed Supreme Court clerks and primetime anchors. Then he did what had become habitual over the years. He interrupted. As Jasmine Crockett began her response, articulating her concern over how the ruling could open doors to unchecked power, Dershowitz waved his hand with theatrical ease and interjected, "With all due respect, Congresswoman, this is complex constitutional law. Perhaps we should stick to the basics." The words were clinical, but the tone was unmistakable. Condescension cloaked in civility. The studio tightened. Cooper looked up briefly from his notes. Behind the glass, the producer whispered to his assistant, "He just cut her off on national TV." And yet, Crockett's reaction was nothing. No flinch, no flash of emotion, just a slow, deliberate blink. Her expression didn't change, but her posture shifted slightly forward, as if something had just clicked into place. She had seen this before, in Texas courtrooms where judges leaned too far toward prosecutors, in debates where male colleagues tried to teach her the law she had practiced under fire. But here was something different. This wasn't just a dismissal of her expertise. It was a public underestimation. And what made it dangerous, for him, was that he had no idea she'd come not just to speak, but to prove. She had read every one of his public statements. She had tracked the shifts in his interpretations, the convenient pivots, the subtle betrayals of principle. And now, in front of a national audience, she had the one thing his reputation could not survive: his own words, lined up in contradiction, and ready to be read aloud. The moment passed quickly. The cameras didn't linger. But the silence after his interruption spoke louder than anything he had just said. Jasmine Crockett, still unreadable, simply nodded. What Dershowitz didn't realize was that his most rehearsed tactic, cutting off challenges with polished authority, had just failed. Spectacularly. Because Crockett wasn't rattled. She was ready. And the next time she opened her mouth, she would begin the slow, steady dismantling of a man who had never truly been held to account. Not like this. And that's when the story really began. The silence that followed Alan Dershowitz's interruption wasn't accidental. It was earned by decades of television dominance, by a resume long enough to fill library shelves. It was the kind of silence that swallowed challenges whole, and for years it had worked. Viewers watched him lean back, exhale, and tighten the knot on his legacy. But this time, something was different. Jasmine Crockett hadn't flinched, hadn't stumbled, hadn't even rushed to reclaim her time. She simply watched, listened, took out a pen and began to write, slowly, methodically, like a trial lawyer preparing a cross-examination, not for a camera, but for the record. And Dershowitz, he kept going. With the practiced rhythm of a man who had testified before Congress and lectured at Oxford, he built his argument on a familiar scaffold, himself. "I've taught at Harvard Law for over 50 years, he began. "I've argued before the Supreme Court more times than most judges have even stepped foot in its chambers. I've advised presidents, written extensively on executive authority, and defended the Constitution when others politicized it." Each line fell like a brick in a wall, constructed not just to protect his argument, but to intimidate dissent. He wasn't just explaining the Constitution, he was reminding the audience who he was and who she wasn't. But Crockett kept writing. She didn't interrupt, didn't challenge, not yet. Instead, she turned each of his accolades into data. Each credential became a breadcrumb, a timestamp, a trail leading back to contradictions she had already memorized. The studio was still. Even Anderson Cooper, a veteran of countless confrontations, could feel the tension shifting, not breaking yet, but slipping, like something heavy about to fall. Then came the calm. Crockett looked up. Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened, clear, surgical. "Respectfully, Professor," she began, "let's not confuse resumes with arguments." The delivery wasn't just respectful, it was disarming. She wasn't playing offense, she was setting terms. What followed wasn't rhetoric, it was a dismantling. A precise, deliberate extraction of inconsistencies. She cited Roberts' majority opinion in the Supreme Court's recent ruling, line by line. Then she cited Dershowitz's own words from 1998, from 2018, from his own published books, each quote stitched carefully into her analysis like courtroom exhibits. And the audience felt it. A shift, not loud, not dramatic, but seismic. Something was off and everyone knew it. Dershowitz, once invincible, was working too hard. His hand gestures grew wider, his interruptions more frequent, his tone slightly defensive. He was playing his old game, command the air, own the frame, bury the critique in historical footnotes. But it wasn't landing, because Crockett wasn't debating. She was building a rhythm, a case, a narrative. And every time he leaned on his credentials, she let him, because she knew The higher he built that pedestal, the further he'd have to fall. What no one knew, not yet, was that Crockett wasn't just arguing about executive privilege. She was about to ask a question that would turn a Harvard professor's resume into Exhibit A against himself. And the clock was ticking. By this point, even casual viewers could feel something was off. Alan Dershowitz, once the conductor of any constitutional conversation he entered, was starting to repeat himself. The charm that once made his arguments feel bulletproof now began to sound like static. Credential after credential, interruption after interruption, a man trying to dominate the clock instead of defend the core of his case. And then came the second interruption. Crockett had just begun a calm, structured response to his latest point when Dershowitz cut in, again. "Congresswoman, you're misinterpreting the legal framework," he said, voice raised just slightly, like a professor correcting a first-year student in front of the class. It was the third time he'd talked over her, and this time it didn't land with authority. It landed with desperation. Anderson Cooper didn't hide his reaction. His tone shifted from moderator to mediator. "Professor," he said firmly, "let her finish." The pause was subtle, but seismic. Crockett didn't flinch, didn't look flustered. Her hands remained folded. But her eyes, now they locked on him with the focus of someone who had just flipped the cross-examination switch. Then, calmly, she said, "Professor, you've referenced your Harvard position 7 times in 6 minutes. You've mentioned arguing before the Supreme Court 4 times. And yet, not once, have you addressed the specific language in Chief Justice Roberts' opinion that directly contradicts your position. Understanding principles is one thing," she continued. "Applying them consistently is another." The words landed like steel wrapped in silk. No anger, no sarcasm, just truth, delivered with surgical precision. And then, quietly, she reached into her folder. It was no theatrical moment, no dramatic flourish, but everyone watching, in the studio and at home, knew what was coming. Receipts. One by one, she laid them out. In 1998, Dershowitz had gone on national television to insist that a president could be investigated, and should be, if he obstructed justice. The context: a Democrat was in office. In 2018, with a Republican in office, Dershowitz reversed himself completely. "A sitting president cannot be investigated," he'd said, on the same network, in the same kind of interview. In 2020, during Trump's first impeachment, Dershowitz argued that abuse of power is not an impeachable offense because it's not explicitly written in the Constitution. Then Crockett held up his own book, a copy of one of his earlier works where Dershowitz himself had written the exact opposite, that criminal-like conduct, even if not a statutory crime, can rise to the level of impeachment. No performance, no drama, just a silent moment where a respected scholar's entire argument was being unraveled, not by theory, but by his own words. For a few seconds, the studio was silent. No rebuttal, no interjection. Even the floor director behind the cameras froze, aware that something far bigger than a policy debate was happening on set. A legacy was cracking, not from a scream, but from a whisper of truth, lined with timestamps. And Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. For nearly 20 minutes, Alan Dershowitz had tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. He leaned harder into his resume, spoke more quickly, repeated familiar phrases about constitutional tradition and legal nuance. He was trying to regain control, to reset the rhythm, but it wasn't working. Each time he cited a case, Jasmine Crockett answered with a quote from his own record. Each time he invoked legal theory, she countered with contradiction. Slowly, methodically, she had backed him into a corner that no reputation could rescue him from. And now, she was ready to close the distance. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a show of it. She simply leaned forward, hands still, eyes locked in. Not with anger, but with purpose. The kind of focus that comes not from ego, but from certainty. "Professor Dershowitz," she said, voice low, even, unshaken. "After 50 years of teaching constitutional law, which should the American people believe?" Your interpretation, when it benefits Republicans? Or the one that benefits Democrats? The words weren't explosive. They were undeniable. They hung in the air like a gavel that had just struck the final verdict. In the control room, a producer mouthed, "Don't cut. Stay on him." Anderson Cooper went completely still. So did the cameras. So did everyone watching. Because what came next was nothing. Alan Dershowitz, a man whose voice had echoed through courtrooms, classrooms, and cable news studios for more than half a century, had no answer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes blinked, unsure of where to land. His face flushed just enough for the cameras to catch. The words weren't there. For the first time in his public life, he had been asked a question he couldn't escape with theory or volume or credentials. He tried, he really did. That's an unfair characterization, he muttered. My interpretations are based on constitutional principles, not partisanship. But the tone betrayed him. It wasn't confident. It wasn't convincing. It was hollow. The authority had cracked. The armor had slipped. And millions of viewers felt it. This wasn't a takedown, not in the traditional sense. There was no shouting, no accusation, no outrage. It was something far rarer on television, a revelation, a legacy exposed not by hostility, but by accountability. And Jasmine Crockett didn't need to press further. She let the silence speak louder than any follow-up. She had spent the entire debate setting the trap, not for humiliation, but for truth. And now that the question had landed, she simply waited, because she knew there was nothing left to say. Alan Dershowitz had just been asked the one question his decades of prestige couldn't shield him from. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't loud, but it pierced deeper than any cross-examination he'd ever faced. Which of your contradictory interpretations should America believe? When they help Republicans or when they help Democrats? And the silence that followed was more than just uncomfortable. It was damning. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't grin or fold her arms or lean back in triumph. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She paused, gave the moment room to breathe, let it settle in the bones of every viewer. Then, quietly and deliberately, she added, "I didn't ask about your intentions, Professor. I asked which of your contradictions the American people should trust." That was the difference. She wasn't questioning his motives. She was holding up a mirror and refusing to look away. In that moment, this wasn't about politics. It was about integrity. In the control room, the lead producer leaned toward her assistant and whispered, "We're watching history." Legal scholars who had once quoted Dershowitz in lectures now leaned forward, stunned. Law students watching the live stream started clipping the segment mid-broadcast, already sensing its place in future textbooks. Even Anderson Cooper didn't say a word. He just stared, sensing the weight of what had just unfolded. This wasn't a takedown by rhetoric. It was a reckoning by record. And yet, Dershowitz still tried. He reached for a familiar line, one he'd used in classrooms and interviews for years. "Constitutional interpretation evolves," he offered, voice thinner now, the words trailing off like they knew they weren't enough. But Crockett didn't let it pass. Her reply was quiet, measured, precise. It always seems to evolve along party lines. No sarcasm, no smirk, just observation, cold and cutting, like the click of a courtroom door closing. That was the blow that landed. Not loud, not theatrical, but inescapable. It didn't aim to wound, it aimed to reveal. The great Alan Dershowitz had not been dismantled by personal attack or political outrage. He had been undone by his own contradictions, brought to light by a woman who didn't shout over him, but simply refused to let him escape the truth. And it worked because she never made it personal. She didn't ask the audience to hate him, she asked them to see him, clearly, without the blur of reputation. And they did. The moment Alan Dershowitz fell silent didn't end when the segment cut to commercial. It began. Within hours, the clip had surged across platforms: Twitter, Reddit, TikTok, legal blogs. Some uploaded it raw. Others captioned it with words like devastating, historic, or a masterclass in accountability. But no matter the spin, the content was clear. Jasmine Crockett had done what dozens of anchors, interviewers, and even rival scholars had failed to do for decades. Not out-talk Dershowitz, but expose the fracture in his foundation. By morning, the clip had surpassed 10 million views. By nightfall, it had become the centerpiece of an entirely new debate, not about executive privilege, but about credibility. At Harvard Law School, where Dershowitz had once walked the halls like a living legend, professors began assigning the segment in constitutional ethics seminars. One lecturer reportedly opened class with a simple prompt: watch this clip, then answer, is consistency more important than experience? Students dissected it with legal precision. Some sympathized with Dershowitz's legacy. Others saw Crockett's performance as a generational shift, the rising demand for clarity over complexity, accountability over prestige. And it wasn't just academia. Commentators across the political spectrum weighed in. Liberal analysts praised Crockett's calm under pressure, her refusal to personalize the conflict. Conservative columnists, even those skeptical of her politics, acknowledged her technique. She didn't play to the cameras, one wrote. She played to the record. And the record won even cable news, often allergic to nuance, covered the aftermath like a legal thriller. The word checkmate trended. But perhaps the most surprising response came not from Twitter or TikTok, but from Dershowitz himself. Weeks later, he published a Wall Street Journal op-ed titled Constitutional Consistency and the Evolution of Legal Thought. On the surface, it read like a routine defense. He reaffirmed his belief in legal nuance. He reminded readers of his long career. But buried beneath the language was something different, a tone of retreat. Recent public discourse, he wrote, has raised legitimate questions about consistency in legal interpretation. While I stand by my analyses, I acknowledge that personal and political factors can influence even the most objective legal mind. That line said more than any rebuttal ever could. He didn't name her, didn't reference the debate. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. This was the concession, subtle, indirect, but unmistakable. For the first time in his storied career, Dershowitz had been forced to reflect not just on what he said, but how often he had said it both ways. And the country, watching in real time, had taken note. The old model, where status insulated inconsistency, had cracked. The idea that legacy could outrun logic had faltered. And the idea that television debates were empty theatre, that notion had just been shattered. Live. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes or pound the desk. She didn't need to. She walked into that studio not to perform, but to prove. And that's exactly what she did. Not through insults, not through emotional grandstanding, but through truth. Sourced, cited, and sharpened like a blade. Through consistency, wielded like a shield against legacy armor. Through quiet control and documented fact, she did something rare on live television. She made America listen not to volume, but to validity. For the first time in decades, Alan Dershowitz's reputation, so long a fortress of untouchable credentials, wasn't enough. It couldn't save him. It couldn't bury his contradictions. It couldn't silence a congresswoman who had come prepared not just for a debate, but for a reckoning. And that's what made it historic. This wasn't just Crockett holding Dershowitz accountable. It was her sending a message to everyone watching, students, scholars, commentators, and citizens alike. Pedigree is not a substitute for principle. Experience means little if it isn't grounded in truth. And power, no matter how polished, is still answerable to integrity. As the cameras began to pan out, the control room stayed silent, still locked into the moment. The air was heavy, not with conflict, but with realization. Then, Jasmine Crockett did something no one expected. She turned toward the camera, away from Dershowitz entirely, and addressed not the professor, but the people. "The Constitution deserves respect," she said quietly, "especially when it's inconvenient." That was her final word, and it echoed louder than any rebuttal ever could. She hadn't come to destroy a man. She had come to defend an ideal. And in doing so, she had set a new precedent, not just for legal discourse, but for public accountability. The segment would go down as one of the most viewed and dissected political exchanges in modern media history. But more than that, it would stand as proof that in a world where credentials are often used to escape scrutiny, clarity and courage can still rewrite the rules.